Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is U.S. Army Major Brian Godwin, who is a Field Artillery and Signals Officer. Brian recently completed the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Brian Godwin, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, likewise. And to our audience, before we get started, just one of those disclaimers, the opinions here on this episode by Brian do not represent the opinions or policy of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Brian, will cover your recent master's thesis, which is entitled From Perception to Protection, Countering Cognitive Warfare in the U.S. Army. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your general comment, your general hot take on some of the challenges that are facing us today?
Sure, John. Yeah, it's a great question. We're in an interesting time, and I'm going to try to avoid using buzzwords and things like that. But I think we're at a time where it's obvious that we are a hyper-connected society. There's a pervasive environment where we're just, we're connected on a way and a scale that we've never been connected before, which is great. Globalization has shown us that this is necessary as we keep getting new technologies out there or getting a feel for how connected we need to be and what the benefits, but also what the risk of those things are. So I think where we stand in the strategic landscape is we're much closer connected, and we're in a spot where we have to understand that all the information, all the data that we're getting out there, it may not be believable at face value, and we have to take a little bit of time to understand where's some of this data, where's some of this information coming from, and how can we use it in the scheme of everything? What's the intent behind it? So I think that's just a quick hot take on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that really helps set the stage for the your research. And warfare is not new. Influence is not new. Getting into your adversary's thought process in order to influence and impose your will, none of that is new. But what's new, as I think you were just describing, is things are qualitatively different right now with the technology that is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the technology that we enjoy today is glorious in that it's helping to uplift, billions of people out of poverty and improve people's lives and health and all kinds of stuff like that. But on the other side of the coin, the challenges and the cognitive related influence abilities that are available today is something that humanity has never experienced. And I think that goes right to some of the things that you and your colleagues there have been studying. So your primary research question was how can the Army protect the force from cognitive warfare? So why did you choose to study this particular topic?
Sure. So I'll say up front, when I asked that question, I'm really looking at the gray zone in that competition space. So below crisis and armed conflict. So just day to day, right? We're not always in a war. I think more often than not, we're not in a war. I'm not going to count GWAT when I say that. But I guess what led me down this path was uh, about 2 years back, I took an organizational behavior class as part of a different master's program. And one of the things that really stuck out to me as I'm taking that class and learning about organizational behavior is we were talking a little bit about biases, heuristics. It kind of led me down the path reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, learn a little bit about systems one and systems two thinking. So forward a little bit, I'm preparing to embark on the Command General Staff College journey, and I get a presentation. It's about an hour long presentation about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, or MDM, and that kind of clicked for me. And I said, I found the organizational behavior piece interesting. It was really interesting to learn about these different biases, heuristics, and these psychological pieces. I'd also read Robert Cialdini's Influence, which I think is
Mm.
a fantastic book, and that led me down the road where I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And then I started thinking, I kind of wonder, how are we protecting the force against cognitive warfare? And I thought, I've worked in the special operations community. I've talked to some psyopers. I've talked to civil affairs, special forces folks, and we always talk a lot about what do we do? What can we do outward? Whether that's informing or whether that's influencing. Um, we don't necessarily talk a lot about, well, what do we do when we look inward? What are we doing to protect ourselves against that? And that's not protecting against something that's overt. I kind of look at it as a little bit more of the subtleties of, how am I kind of protecting a new soldier who is getting their news or their information from a social media platform, that's controlled by different algorithms, that's kind of pushing and pulling and nudging that person towards certain topics. And it really interested me. And as I started asking that question, as we engage with different guest speakers, and I started reaching out to different organizations, I said, so like, hey, this is cool, we can do all these things. But how are we protecting ourselves against that? And there was a lot less of a solid answer, if any answer, than I expected. And that
Mm.
kind of solidified in my mind, this is a good question to ask. This is a good question to research.
Yeah, 100%. Um, so, getting a little bit further into your study, I think it's important to try to define terms, and you do this. So, how do you define cognitive warfare, and what is the problem the Army faces related to cognitive warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. So up front, I'll say that if you look up cognitive warfare, you Google it, or I guess you can even ask ChatGPT if you want to.
Hmm.
Um, you're you're not gonna find like an agreed upon definition. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I think NATO has their cognitive warfare concept they're working on right now, and they're trying to define it. Other countries define it certain ways. The U.S. really doesn't actually define it, which is I find kind of interesting. We don't really talk about it. Um, so what I did was, as I looked at at all these definitions, I found comment or remarks at a speech given in Riga, Latvia in 2022 by the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation. And I kind of took pieces of his speech and I put it together in addition to the other definitions, the other papers that I read. And I'm like, this seems like this is a good definition. I think this makes sense. And the way I defined it was, I said, cognitive warfare generates cognitive effects through actions in the five military domains. That's your land, air, sea, base, and cyber domains, and in the information environment. Again, the information environment is pervasive. It's all around us. It's exploiting hyperconnectivity, data pervasiveness, psychological warfare, and cognitive sciences to influence both what people think and how people act. And it's really taking advantages of some of those things that we talked about, the advances in digital technology at the individual and network levels, which can be used for good things, or it can also be used to manipulate psychological, social, and again in the information environment.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah, but back to what you're saying at the top of your response, um, things are. Yeah, you could ask 10 different experts and get 10 slightly different answers to that kind of a question. So yeah, but I think that it's just really important for people like you, or to get thoughts from people like you out into the discourse so that it can stimulate additional conversation and dialogue and around these important topics. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, sure. So that's how I define it. And then kind of looking at what is the problem that the Army is facing related to this. So we have adversaries, or if you look at the national defense strategy, you could say they're threats. So we have a pacing threat, which would be China, and an acute threat, which would be Russia. And both of them are using cognitive warfare, kind of as I defined it, to exploit the information environment and do their manipulation or influencing. So you could start with looking at the way that China is conducting warfare, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you know, China has its three warfare that it follows. So you know, you're looking at your political or your public opinion warfare, your psychological warfare, and your legal warfare. And
Mhm.
if you kind of look back a little bit into history and you say, well, what did Russia do? And we can very easily talk about active measures, and we can look at the Cold War and disinformation, kind of leading into all the things that are culminating with today as we're seeing the information space around the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I say all that to say, when I look in that competition space and I kind of look at, and again, I had to keep it at a low unclassified level to be able to publish this. I kind of I looked at Army Doctrine, training, leadership, education, and policies, and I wondered as I looked through them, taking a look at these two actors, are those different areas adequate enough to protect the force from cognitive warfare effects? And I think because these adversaries are operating in that gray zone, because no one wants to really get to armed conflict, right? If I can win a war without fighting you, that's what I want to do. Or I want to degrade you so much to that point that when we actually do get to armed conflict or something of that sort, the fights, I have the advantage in that fight. So I guess the problem that I'm looking at in this case is what we have now adequate to protect that against all those effects? And from what I found, generally it there wasn't a whole lot doctrinally. There wasn't a whole lot in our professional military education or our training that we conduct, like our initial entry training, the advanced individual training, things like that. And there's really nothing significant on the policy side
Mm,
that goes to address these things.
I see. So, yeah, paraphrasing what you were just saying, then your research question is leading you towards examining whether or not current Army doctrine is adequate to counter cognitive warfare, I think. And you've got a couple of case studies, one Russian and one Chinese, which helped you answer that question and dive a little deeper. So do you think you could go into those case studies?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two case studies I use, I looked at what China was doing during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I started in 2020 all the way through 2021. So as we all experienced in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off, and we kind of start to see different responses from different countries. So looking at the way that China approached it, and again, I'm not authoritative on this, so and I know this is a
Hmm.
still fresh subject. So my understanding and what I researched was, you know, as this kicks off, we start to see a little bit of the suppression of information after that initial flare was shot up by some scientists in China. So that kind of started off China's attempt to kind of control public opinion. And as they got control of that domestic, I don't hiccup, I guess maybe you'd
Mm,
call it a hiccup for them.
mm,
As they got control of that, then they start to focus outward on how do we keep public opinion of the international audience looking favorably toward China, or how do we divert the attention from the effects of the pandemic away from us. So that's when you start to see all just different things. I looked at a bunch of different tweets that some of their foreign minister and at this point, China's not really internally. China's not using Twitter, for example. All of a sudden, you would see an increase in Twitter accounts, and these are a lot of their they're the foreign diplomats that are pushing out messaging, or they're starting to call out like, "Hey, the United States, Fort Detrick, there's biolabs, and there's all these sort of things that start occurring. So you start to see kind of a push of the blame a little bit, or trying to redirect attention away from China. So this kind of continues on for a little bit, and really a lot of this blame game kind of continues as vaccinations are coming to fruition. You start to see different forces economically, politically, to promote maybe a domestic vaccines that the Chinese are producing, or to go and say, hey, those vaccines that other countries are producing, those actually aren't safe, or hey, look at how terribly these countries are handling the pandemic. So disinformation is coming through this through different social media means. There's all sorts of different techniques and tactics that the Chinese are using to kind of control this narrative, and to continue to further push out what they want the world to believe.
I see.
So that's a China case that I looked at, and I ended it in the end of 2021, and that's really when they started focusing on their lockdowns, and there's less external messaging going to international audience. So as I pivot, the other case that I looked at was the 2016 election interference by the Russians, and can be a controversial topic, but
yeah. Well, so I mean, so stipulated.
Sure.
It's hard to talk about these kinds of recent dynamics without brushing up against some live social discourse that is happening within our own country. But this is a academic examination, so it's not political.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just do realize that there's some controversy behind it.
Sure. Oh yeah, 100%. Oh yeah.
But yeah, as you look at the Russian case study, really starts in 2015, and there's a few events that occurred before this, but really you start to see like the Internet Research Agency, or the IRA for the Russians, purchasing ads, creating on social media. They're creating inauthentic accounts, and they're trying to amplify divisive social and political messages through those various means, right? Again, we're exploiting these algorithms, we're hyper connected. If you like something, or you look at something, one of your friends may see that, or maybe suggest it for them, or now you're just starting to see, based on your browsing history, things are popping up. So you start to see that. You start to see troll efforts. So we talk about the bot armies. We talk about actually people that are creating inauthentic personas to push messaging, to amplify or de-amplify, for example, political candidates. You start to see an influence of these offline, or these online efforts are trying to influence offline activities. So maybe I'm creating Facebook, for example, I'm creating a Facebook group as the Russians, to pick a politically divisive theme. It could be just violence, it could be poverty, it could be, pick your thing you want to talk about. I'm creating that group, people are joining that group, they're seeing the messaging is coming out from it, and now I'm saying, as that Russian ringleader, of course you don't know that I'm the Russian ringleader until this has come out, but I'm basically saying, hey, maybe you should go out and protest this, or rally, or let's get petitions signed, or hey, this organization or this institution or these people are good or they're bad. And now I'm trying to influence and persuade you, and I'm trying to amplify those things. So this continues throughout. There's some cyber attacks in there, and with the hacking of the Democratic National Committee, the leak of documents. You have I hope to never have to say this name too many more times, with the Guccifer persona
Mm, hmm.
releasing
Yeah.
and hacking those things. And just there's just this whole that whole campaign can, and there's plenty of documentation on this. There's the Senate committees that looked into this, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. There's plenty of well-informed analysis through independent agencies that talk about the election interference. Some of them can almost go day by day in some cases that I've seen. So this all continues, and whether or not that had an effect, or what the scale of that effect was on the outcome of an election,
Hmm.
or whether or not it's kind of a testing of what can we get away with and what can we do. Um, that I think that was the end state with the election interference, a little bit of undermining,
Yeah.
a little bit of amplifying, and things like that.
I see. All right. Well, great. So how do you take those two um, studies, those two recent episodes, and analyze uh, the Army's doctrine and capabilities related to being able to counter that kind of cognitive warfare?
Yeah, sure. So what I did was I looked at joint publications, so joint doctrine. I looked at Army doctrine, and I really just started doing. I just did a lot of reading, and I
Hmm.
made a lot of notes and said, okay, cool. Within competition, what what capabilities or what activities do we have or do we conduct to kind of counter some of these things? And doctrine's being updated. We expect there's going to be an information doctrine getting published, hopefully
Mm.
within the next year. I'll talk a little bit more about information advantage and some of these other things. But so when you look at the capabilities, you can talk about, I'll use an old term, so someone might call me on this, but information related capabilities, or IRCs. Those are things like operational security, or OPSEC, public
Mm.
affairs, electronic warfare, et cetera. So I kind of look at that and I say, okay, within looking at these cases and looking at the way that I coded these things, and I said persuasion, I said amplification, I said undermining institutions, or polarization. Okay, what tools would we have under the threshold of armed conflict to kind of protect the force? And
Hmm.
really the one thing, as I did the coding and I looked at all these examples, was we had public affairs is really the big thing that we had across doctrine, across looking at training curriculum for individual entry training, advanced individual training, professional military education, including a course like I'm completing now at the Command and General Staff College,
Hmm.
and then just kind of looking at any policies that are out there talking about disinformation, propaganda, information warfare, et cetera. And really, that was it. It was pretty much the public affairs piece is what the Army has in that. So, um, kind of counter to maybe looking over at Marine Corps doctrine, the new MCDP 8
Hmm.
was published on information, and one of the things they talk about is force resiliency, and they call out one specific thing, and they say, hey, we know media literacy is really important. And we know media literacy is important because our Marines are going to be facing an information environment where they need to understand or be able to critically think about the information that they're receiving in the context that they're receiving it, and what does it actually mean. Not I'm not telling you how to think, or I'm sorry, I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you a little bit like, this is kind of how you should start to think about different information, different data that you're receiving as we're looking at this pervasive environment.
I see. And I know our audience does not have access to your study just yet, but we will, when the study is made publicly available, we'll be sure to have a link to that in the show notes. So if you're listening to this when this episode comes out, like in late June of 2023, that link might not be in there. But if you're listening to it a year from now, we should have a link to Brian's study. But you've got some nifty charts that where you qualitatively score uh, the Army's doctrine and on those various different dimensions, right? The
Yep.
persuade dimension, the polarized dimension, public agenda dimension and the institutional dimension. And so you score all this out, and you know, what is kind of like the bottom line on all of this various different scoring? What are the things that fall out for you?
Right. So as I look at, again, I look at all those events across the case studies, and I categorize it by, we use the .mil PFP whenever we talk about a lot of
Hmm.
these things. So the doctrine, organization, training, and things like that. And as I look across doctrine, training, leadership and education and policies, I just look and say, okay, on a scale of 0 to 2, and I know it's a weird scale. It's is it mostly ineffective? Is it partially effective, or is it mostly effective? And what I found is looking at those capabilities in doctrine is, there in contextually those instances that I found, there wasn't a whole lot. There wasn't a whole lot that any of those capabilities doctrinally provided, full in that gray zone, um, with this so to kind of counter those things. And what really just stood out to me again was, there's public affairs, and I know we don't have a whole lot of public affairs folks, and they cannot be nearly as far into things as they would probably like to be, or as we would like them to be. One thing that kind of stands out to me, we have a ban on TikTok right now.
Mm.
Can't use it in the DoD. A lot of governments are banning it for use in their organizations, and that's kind of a blind spot, right? Because if my some of my soldiers are using TikTok, and they are Generation Z. I mean, really, a lot of generations are using it. Um, that's it's difficult, because now my public affairs people can't really reach into that, so I can't really inform those. Hey, what you're seeing on here is maybe being manipulated, maybe it's false. So that's really challenging. But again, the public affairs are really the biggest tool that we have, because I really didn't see anything in training that stood out to me. And now I qualify all that and say I looked at those specific categories, and I looked at what I could look at an unclassified level. Um, but I couldn't account for, in my study and the skill that I had, what are your prior experiences that you're bringing into the military,
Mm.
whether that's just experiences you've had growing up, or in at the educational system. We don't really standardize education across the US. It's really, each state has their kind of their own standards. So that is you might have a different perspective, coming into the Army, or different set of tools or capabilities versus someone else. And there's just those things I couldn't account for. And that's like, I think that's probably multiple dissertation level analysis that would have to be done to really understand that.
Right. So do you think you could hit upon, you know, what your key recommendations are that are coming out of this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I just ask, again, how can we counter that,
Hmm.
or how do we counter cognitive warfare? Really, first of all, is understanding what are the enemy's strategies and tactics for this, right? Investing in technology and tools to help educate, and to help kind of counter, or realizing that these things are occurring,
Hmm.
and prioritizing training and education. So beginning to the actual that primary research question, I looked at really three things that I would recommend. And I looked at media literacy training. I think that's important. Again, I talked
Hmm.
about MCDP 8 mentions it. I think it's important to provide that training continuously throughout our Army career. We have a lot of continuous training requirements that we have to do for different things, and I think I hate to add more mandatory training on a thing, but it's
Hmm.
pretty important with the information landscape, and understanding that as we go forward, we're just going to continue to be more connected. There's going to be more technologies out there that we need to understand, and we need to understand what information and what data is passing through or being presented by those technologies. Um, the other thing that one of the other things I looked at was application of inoculation theory. So this is kind of, if you want to use the vaccination analogy, which is really what it comes from, it's I can introduce something to you and let you know that it's coming. So I kind of give you this whole, there's this like kind of threat message, and hey, you know, you may be a persuasive attack may be coming, for example. And once I've told you about that, now I can kind of do this preemption, um, passively or actively, and I can provide you with kind of some counter arguments to that attack. So once it actually comes, now you're able to kind of see through it, or kind of um, not let it set in or anchor you. Because if you've heard it and you don't have a counter to it, you may have a tendency to refer back to it, even if after the fact you know it's false information. I think that's just like it's pretty high into the cognitive science piece. But also, I can look at the active inoculation piece, which is now you have some arguments. I've encouraged you to create or generate your own counter arguments against threats, so it's a little bit more of a stronger reaction to disinformation, to any of these other things that are occurring in the information space, and that gives you a little bit more involvement. And also, you now have a stronger counter message that you can share amongst, like I turn to my colleague and I say, hey, this is why this thing that you're seeing is false, or it's misleading, or it's out of context. So inoculation theory. And then the other piece that I look at or that I recommend is we really just need to actively engage with our joint interagency, intergovernmental, and international partners to recognize, counter, and protect against cognitive warfare. The Army can't do it by itself. I would argue the DoD can't do it by itself. It's kind of a whole society thing, and it's something that we need to actively engage on, talk about, and work to help kind of counter these things, share best practices, and have a concerted effort to de-amplify that messaging that's coming out that's trying to manipulate and persuade. I think a lot of these actors are playing the long game, and it's kind of hard with our attention economy as it is now, with all these different things, to keep sight of something that may have occurred a few years ago, maybe even a few weeks ago. It's just it's just a small piece in the overall puzzle that these countries are kind of trying to solve to get to what they want to get to. So those are kind of the areas or the recommendations that I went after.
Yeah, yeah. Pretty simple stuff. Pretty basic. It's not going to take much to tackle those kinds of challenges. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, wow, that is great stuff, Brian. Some fantastic recommendations, and I think, like you said, it goes well beyond just the Army into whole of society, maybe even Western, all across Western societies, and free democracies can all probably expend some resources examining and orienting and countering this problem. It is pervasive. So how about we do a lightning round, and then we'll close out, so 30 seconds to 1 minute per
sure.
answer. And so starting this off, cognitive prep of the battlefield.
It's a tough one. It's occurring. It's occurring right now. Whether or not you realize it, it's happening. I don't want to use the TikTok example, but there's so many other things, but that's a good one people can recognize. There's all sorts of things going on. Whenever a message comes out, whenever an event occurs, there's usually something behind that. There's a narrative, there's an intent, there's some kind of message, right? If I fly jets over somewhere, if I push out a meme, if I do something like that, there's usually some kind of intent behind that. So I would argue that it's occurring all the time, and it's going to be even worse as we get into AI generated content and blurring the lines between what's real and what's not.
Yeah, for sure. And to our audience, we had a great episode way back up at the beginning of this podcast with Jan Kahlberg and Stephen Hamilton of the Army Cyber Institute, but they talk about force protection in the cognitive domain, and they get into that kind of a concept of cognitive prep of the battlefield as well. So maybe check that out. All right, second lightning round, information advantage.
Ooh, information advantage. That's a hard one. As I say that in a scholars program.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Information, it's all around us. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. I think it's having the right information to enable our decision makers to inform, to better understand our adversaries, and then to be able to degrade um, all of those things on the opposite side. How I define information advantage now is I say it's very contextual. Depends on what you're trying to achieve and what the environment is that you're walking into and what the problem is that you're facing.
Okay. And last lightning round, maneuver.
Maneuver. What are you getting at with maneuver?
Well, how do military forces engage and use other instruments of power in order to impose will on the adversary and to hopefully try to do all of that while minimizing friendly damage, maximizing enemy damage, or engaging below the level of armed conflict and out competing ultimately without having to fire a shot.
Yeah,
Maneuver.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Maneuver. Understand the problem first.
Mm,
We don't spend a lot of time understanding the problem, I think, which is it's a waterfall, right? If you don't get it right at the top, it's just going to continue to pull and to grow at the bottom, and it may be the wrong thing. So
mm,
uh, I would say just really understand that operational environment. Again, understanding your adversaries that you're operating against, and understanding. And this is hard. Understanding all of the different social, political, and cultural things in that environment, and that's really difficult. So there's so many entities in there that are playing. There's history at play. There's cultural beliefs and dynamics at play. So just trying to understand that, really listening to those people. If someone's saying, we're going to win this by just rolling tanks through, maybe that was really good during World War II. And not to say land power isn't essential, but we really need to understand a little bit more of the information space and how to win that fight.
yeah, 100%. I really like that waterfall analogy. That's spot on. Okay, well, this has been fantastic, Brian. Think we could close out and you suggest a book or other online resource to our audience if they want to take a deeper dive into some of this subject matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll actually throw a couple out there if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked Media Warfare: Taiwan's Battle for the Cognitive Domain by Kerry Gershonek. He also has a book entitled Political Warfare. I thought those were really interesting. I mentioned Influence by Robert Cialdini. He has a new one. I
Mm,
think it's Influence, New and Expanded. This is a fun one for my military folks and maybe for some others, but the Art of Insubordination: How to Dissent and Defy Effectively by Todd Kashdan. That's a great one. And if you're struggling to understand all the information environment and the pervasiveness of all these things and all the data that's getting collected on you, the Social Dilemma is a Netflix documentary, and I thought it was actually pretty decent. I think it's a nice little dip into, hey, these are all the data points and all the things that are being collected um, by companies that you click accept on for the privacy policies. So
hmm
I think it's a good one as well. So those are three books and one documentary I'd recommend just to you know orient yourself on certain things.
Excellent. What's next for you, Brian? Where are you off to?
Yeah, so I'm heading to beautiful Maryland, where I'm sure I'm going to be eating a bunch of crab and trying to apply all the things that I've learned here at the Command and General Staff College in my next job as an operations officer. So I'm really looking forward to it. It should be a good experience.
All right, fantastic. Well, we wish you Godspeed as you continue to do great things in support of our nation. And with that, Brian Godwin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, Visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.